Mr. Winder, welcome. Thank you for coming. Sorry you were delayed at the last meeting by adverse weather, but thank you for making your time available today.
Great.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. The presentation that I have this morning is reasonably short and high level, and I thought that was appropriate as a sort of a reminder of what's in the report. I think probably the value that you'll get from today is by asking questions rather than what I may say in the presentation. What we undertook to do was to develop a financial model that was capable of exploring a range of different local government reform options.
Excuse me, Mr. Winder, before you go through, would you prefer to give your presentation uninterrupted? It might be best if we did it that way, wouldn't it?
I think so, yes.
Yes, all right.
Thank you.
So, councillors, if you just, or committee members, if you just hold your questions until the conclusion of the presentation. Sorry for interrupting.
Sure. So the core of the piece of work we did was the development of a financial model that took the 10-year long-term plans that are currently in existence and used them as the basis of estimating potential costs and savings of different reform options. In order to do them, the first steps that we had, or in order to do that, the first steps we had to do was to take the long-term plans and standardise them and massage them, because as I'm sure you are aware, every council presents its long-term plan differently. So things that are in one activity or group of activities in one council are in a different group of activities in a different council. So we spent quite a long time trying to pick apart the long-term plans with the assistance of staff in each of the councils to come up with a standard set of activities, to break the groups of activities that are reported in the long-term plan down to individual activities, and within them to split out staff costs and direct costs and separate out overheads. And again, that was a quite challenging process. Every council has a different way of allocating overheads, and depending on the size of the council, it's relatively more or less straightforward to split out staff costs and direct costs associated, or overhead and direct staff costs associated with a particular activity. If you're talking about Central Hawke's Bay or Wairoa, where there's one manager that does several things that each are a significant and discrete activity, they had some quite significant challenges with trying to allocate costs. The other thing that we did was to split out, or to exclude CapEx and depreciation. And the reason for doing that was we really decided that it would be unfair and inappropriate to prejudge what decisions a future council may make about the need to proceed with CapEx as was provided for in the long-term plans, because that would very quickly go to a difference in the level of service provided. So in essence, we ignored potential changes in CapEx, and because of that, we ignored any changes in depreciation that might arise. That slide gives you a sense of the range of activities that we looked at, and what we were trying to do here was to make sure that in looking at the costs or potential savings of reform, that it was informed by and reflected the range of activities that the councils undertook, and the differences in their cost structure and differences in the potential for savings through economies of scope or scale. That slide gives you a sense of where the money goes. So obviously any assumptions that we make about roading are hugely material. 24% of the expenditure of this is operating expenditure excluding CapEx and depreciation. 24% goes on roading and transport across the 5 councils in the region. Therefore, any assumptions you make about potential savings in that area are very material and will have a quite large effect on the outcome. Equally, the 29% that's down here in recreation community, the 20.9% and the 16% over here in Three Waters, that's where the lion's share of the money goes. So any assumptions that relate to those activities will have a very material impact on the bottom line result. For each of the activities, we captured key cost drivers. So we sought from each local authority the number of staff that were involved in the activity and a range of other measures that we could use to look at the sort of unit costs of production or variations in the cost structure associated with that activity. So that included things like the length of the pipe network that was being maintained, the length of sealed and unsealed roads that councils were maintaining, the area of land that they managed, the number of public toilets they operated, the number of consents they processed, those sorts of things. And that enabled us to look at, for instance, at the sort of metrics of production around the number of staff that it took to process a resource consent, the cost per seat for IT costs of having someone sitting in an organisation, the cost per kilometre of maintaining roads and so on. So those weren't used as direct drivers of the model, but more enabled us to understand the cost differences between the councils and where there was potential to move from a high cost operation to a lower cost operation. For instance, the difference between the number of staff that are required to process a consent differs quite significantly across the councils. The cost of IT expenditure per employee differs quite dramatically across the councils. So simply assuming that you could move towards the lower end of that rather than the high end of that gives a very clear indication of the scale of savings that are possible or would be possible through reform. We were asked to investigate three options. The first of those you will be very familiar with is the proposition from A Better Hawke's Bay that is with the Local Government Commission. The other two were arrived at by staff here. They are not necessarily options that we would have chosen, but we were asked to do them and we have. The model is capable of being used to explore any combination that you want. So if there were other things that, for instance, the Local Government Commission wished to pursue or that you wished to pursue in response to them, the model can be used for that purpose. There's a raft of key assumptions. We deliberately did not exclude the very small parts of the regional jurisdiction that are in other councils, so we've really only considered Wairoa, Napier, Hastings, Central Hawke's Bay and the Regional Council. Where an activity is undertaken by only one council in the region, we assumed that there would be no savings. Now, that's not necessarily the case, but it was a convenient assumption in terms of how we simplify things. We've not explored the potential for any sale of assets, and again, as you rationalise in amalgamation, there would be surplus assets, a question of offices and those sorts of things. We've not explored that. We've, as I said earlier, made no changes to the intended capital works program of the existing councils, and no changes to planned levels of depreciation. And we've tried to ensure that the changes that we've made would not result in changes to the level of service. We've assumed that any new council would be operational from the 1st of July 2015. That's probably not feasible in terms of the timeline that the Local Government Commission is now on, but it's a very convenient start of the financial year in terms of how we could do this from the long-term plans. We've assumed that there would be a transition board process as provided for by the Local Government Act and that there would be costs associated with that. We've gone through each of the scenarios and estimated directly the governance costs associated with the governance framework that would be in place in each of those scenarios, a number of councillors, community board members and so on. And equally, we've directly estimated the management costs that would be appropriate with that structure. At the top, the top two tiers. We did not explore in detail the redundancy provisions of existing councils. We've assumed that redundancy cost would equal the first year of salary savings. So in essence, we've assumed that you would in the first year incur, or in the first period after amalgamation, incur redundancy costs. The savings from having fewer staff wouldn't commence until a year after that. So we haven't directly estimated redundancy, we've just maintained the salaries of those staff that would disappear for a year. Now, that may or may not be adequate in terms of the actual scale of the redundancy provisions that apply in some councils, but we thought it was inappropriate to go to the next stage without a very detailed design of the organisation. We've assumed that direct costs, savings in direct costs, start in year 2 of operation of a new council, and that where there are major contracts, they would need to run their course. So, for instance, with respect to roading, we've assumed that you can't commence savings in roading until you reach a break point in the existing contracts for service and maintenance. And beyond that, we've gone through activity by activity, council by council, to look at the potential for savings, and in quite a number of areas, we end up assuming that it's unlikely or it's not possible to achieve savings. So, for instance, if you think about the three water supply systems, we've assumed it would be very difficult to secure direct cost savings associated with the supply of water, simply because we have a number of completely discrete schemes that are all different, and amalgamating the governance structure is not going to change a bit the physical reality of having a number of schemes that you have to maintain. In terms of how we got there, we started off a process of gathering the LTP data and disaggregating it. We then had quite a long process of going backwards and forwards with the councils as we confirmed the numbers, and endeavoured to ensure that the way that we had disaggregated them and the way that they had provided information to us matched, and we did have the correct numbers. It took quite a long time going backwards and forwards, in particular with Wairoa and Central Hawke's Bay, to get to the point where the numbers all reconciled, and in particular the allocation of staff to activities reconciled. We then, as a team, went through and made some initial estimates of savings based on our observations, our analysis of the cost drivers, and our experience. We then came down to Hawke's Bay and ran a workshop that involved the chief financial officers and others of each of the councils, and worked through the assumptions that we have made and tested them with them to say, is this reasonable, can this work, and so on. That was a challenging workshop because I'm sure, as you would appreciate, there were very different perspectives in the room as to the scope for potential savings and the attractiveness of that. There were quite a large number of areas where it was impossible to get a common view amongst the officials that were in the room. There were others where it was quite readily achieved. Generally, if our starting assumption was that it was not likely that you would get savings, that was quite readily agreed by the officials in the room. We then went away and consolidated that and reworked some of the assumptions to come up with some final estimates, and they're reflected in the report. In terms of the costs of transition, in essence, we built up those costs by thinking about all of the different cost exposures there are associated with a transition or merger of organisations. We based that substantially on the Auckland experience of transition and the sorts of things that happened and what drove costs. Obvious major elements of that are you have a transition board that's making decisions, they've got to be paid for. You have substantial recruitment costs in transitional salaries because you end up, in essence, with the management team of the new organisation before it exists, and they've got to be paid for as they work through the process of set-up and establishment. There's a significant HR transition team that's required to line up the jobs with the design of the organisation and manage the how you match people to jobs process between the existing councils and the future council. There's a major piece of work to do around how you transition business systems. Now, and this is a key element of cost in transition. The assumption that we've made here is that it would be possible to select for each of the business systems that are required, it would be possible to select one from within the existing councils and adjust that as necessary to provide the platform for the new council. That is the approach that was used in the establishment of Auckland Transport, where Auckland Transport took the ARC's core financials and business systems and adapted them for its purpose. That cost about $2 million. That is a substantially different number than the process that the Auckland Council itself went through, which is in the hundreds of millions, to completely integrate all of their systems. So again, a hugely material assumption that there is within the existing councils the core of what a new council would require as business systems that can be adapted. We've made a provision for the translation of records and data, and again, out of the Auckland experience, there is a large team still sat on the third floor of the Civic Building that was part of Auckland City Council that is now progressively working through the tonnes of paper of each of the 8 councils to ensure that they are all integrated into one cohesive archive. We've made an allowance for that. Whether it's sufficient or not, only time would tell, but it's a significant piece of work in itself. We've also provided for not just a one-off cost associated with harmonising salaries, but an ongoing cost associated with that. One of the issues when you bring together staff from a number of different organisations is what you do with the very different conditions of employment and remuneration that you inherit. And it's relatively easy for that to end up being everybody moves to the best of everything. It's altogether more difficult to negotiate an outcome that delivers a fair and reasonable set of compromises. Auckland did an okay job at that. And there was significant downward pressure on salaries across quite a number of the councils that went in to create the Auckland Council. In total, we came to an estimate of costs of transition in the order of 13 to 18 million. It's an estimate based on quite broad assumptions and experience. We then went through to estimate savings. As I said earlier, we directly estimated the costs of the new governance and management structure for each of the scenarios, and activity by activity we went through and came to a view as to what level of savings would be possible. We were doing this for each year of the balance of the long-term plan after the go-live date. So the model basically gives you a level of possible savings for each activity for each year. Of those, the most material challenge and set of assumptions relate to roading. It's 22% of expenditure. NZTA has done a substantial amount of work recently looking at the potential for savings through clusters of local authorities and different ways of procuring road maintenance and construction work and professional services. Their estimates or their work suggests that there are economies of scale associated with the size of contract that is used to go to the market for road maintenance and the nature of contract, in particular moving to fence line contracts. They've also identified quite significant potential savings associated with professional services that go with having scale in the procurement agency. There was substantial disagreement at the workshop we had with officials here as to the potential to realise those benefits in Hawke's Bay. The conclusion we came to is that there are potential savings, but they will be quite difficult to secure. In the professional services area, we think there is scope, and in essence, having a larger authority that has better potential to employ senior and well-qualified engineers and professional services with respect to roading increases the likelihood that you are buying the right things and that you are making the right decisions about the level of road maintenance and activities that you undertake. And I suppose my direct experience of looking at Kaipara and the historic decisions Kaipara has made about road maintenance and the difference it makes when you can inject a higher level of professionalism and reassessment in that, my gut tells me there is potential here that would come directly from changes in the scope of professional services you were able to maintain. As I said, the assumptions about roading are hugely material. So overall, the results from the report, you'll see there we've brought together the costs across the balance of the long-term plans to show total expenditure in this row in each of the years, and what that looks like by scenario, and what the total net savings are. The red negative figures reflect the incidence of the transition costs, so that you can see here that you've got to find money in those 2 years in particular, and thereafter you're in payback time, and the payback period associated with scenario A is actually very short in terms of getting on the right side of the ledger. But in total, the magnitude of savings are not enormous in terms of the work that we've done. So I suppose in conclusion, transition costs are significant. The net savings in total are less than 4% of expenditure. That is very sensitive to where you get to with roading. The payback period for scenario A is quite short. It's slightly longer for B and longer again for C. There are a raft of other issues, and I suppose in wrapping up this, we were asked to look at the costs and benefits in dollar terms. There are a raft of other things that obviously need to be considered. And one of the key ones that goes directly with that is the incidence of what increases in costs or savings there may be. As you harmonise the rating system, there are winners and losers, and it's very easy for any of the potential savings to get lost in changes in incidence of rates, which is quite a significant challenge. And certainly in Auckland, they've had to move to capping the maximum increase in rates for a number of large areas of the city to avoid 3 years of more than 20% rates increases for people that were already at the high end of rates payments. There are also a range of other benefits and non-monetary costs that will need to be considered and are part of the framework of the Local Government Commission. Cutting across all of this, I suppose, is quite out the other side, organisations that have a very different scope, and I suppose exploring the difference between the change in scope that comes with being larger and having a more regional vision as opposed to being smaller is quite significant, and needs to be weighed up against the potential scale economies in a consideration. Second to last point there, savings versus level of service. In my observation, where amalgamations have resulted in the ability to save costs, generally they haven't been translated in savings to ratepayers. They've been used to change levels of service. And that's quite significant because when you look across the local authorities in Hawke's Bay, they do have very different levels of service. So whilst we've cut across this and said you could provide the current levels of service at less cost, that leaves you with the other question of how might you harmonise service standards, and even what appears trivial in Auckland, the debate about free swimming pools is a very expensive example of the challenge that you have of how you harmonise service levels when you combine councils. And then the last comment would be, we really didn't touch on levels of debt, but in this it will also be important to reflect on the nature of the visible financial debt and the invisible debt of what's sitting in the ground that hasn't been looked after or may not have been looked after as well in one council as it has in another one. Which again goes you to the question of what exactly you're harmonising and the swings and roundabouts with that. happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Peter.